So now that I have my basic movement system down for this project, I think what I'll do is I'll throw in the ability to shoot. And in order to do this, I'll create a little turret. And my plan will be to create a sphere. And I'll just move this up just a little bit and also throw a cylinder into the equation. I'm going to scale that cylinder down. And I'll rotate that cylinder. Let's see, I'll just move this up a little bit and kind of poke that through the top of the, or the front of my sphere. And so if I take that cylinder and throw it inside the sphere, I should be able to rotate my sphere there and have that look around. And it'll look like that's a cannon barrel. So now, instead of throwing this sphere into my tank object, the best practice here is, now that I'm going to get a couple different moving parts here, the best practice here is going to be throw all of this into an empty game object. So that original tweak that I did in the previous presentation to set the vector 3 XYZ and to fix the y-axis, I'll probably have to undo that here in a minute, but it won't be a whole lot of work. What I'll do is I'll create an empty game object. This game object is going to be my player. I can rename it later if I don't like the name player. And I'm going to set its y position to 0. I'm not so concerned about its x and its z. I'll manually move that around as needed. But I'll take the tank object and I'll throw that inside my player object. And so the result here is that my tank object is now its registration point is sitting at the ground level. I don't want to control the tank object itself with this state machine that I built in the previous presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, I'm going to copy this FSM, I'll right click again, and I'll choose to remove it. So I'm no longer controlling the tank. I'll go to the player object and I'll right click and add, oops, don't want to add, I want to paste that previous FSM. So now the only glitch that I'm going to have here, this should work just fine. I'll click the move button. And you can see that it moves that, but the result is going to be, I suspect, that my object is going to be floating in space. So yeah, I can see that it's actually off the ground here. And that's because in the previous presentation, we fixed our vector 3 and told it to go to 0.5 on the y-axis. So I'll just turn that off, and that should fix my new problem. Let me just test this out real quick. There we go. That looks like it's working the way it's supposed to. So I'll turn that play button off. I'll collapse my hierarchy. I inadvertently revealed that. Now I'll go back to player. I'll go back to tank. And the tank looks like it's in a pretty good position, although I do want to zero out the z-axis. There we go. And I'll also take that new sphere that I just created and I'll throw that into my player object as well. I'll take that sphere and I'll move it down and I'll make sure everything lines up pretty well. There we go. I'll just place it there for now. And so then the idea here is that I can rotate the y value of my turret and it'll point in the direction, and soon I'll be instantiating objects based on either a key input or some mouse input. So I'll just zero out my y rotation again. I'll call this, instead of sphere, I'll call it turret. And so I'm controlling the player object with a left click. And I'll go into the turret and I'll add an FSM, and I'll use that same trick that I used before with the mouse pick input. So I'm looking for mouse look. Where did you go? Mouse pick. There it is, mouse pick. I'll double click. And so I'll create a new variable, and I could call this pick point as well, because it won't conflict with the other state machine. But I'll call this target point. Or maybe target look at. Well, I'll call it target point. And I'll set this to vector 3, and I'll add that. I'll go back to my state, and so for the store point, I'll use this target point, and I have the same setup going on now. I have 2 mouse picks in the scene, and this one will run as I roll my mouse around. Well, it should be updating, but I forgot to check every frame. That's why I'm not getting the feedback that I wanted. So I'll go back into my state. I'll make sure that says every frame. And now as I roll my mouse around, I'm basically doing the same exact thing that I did in my previous presentation. But this time what I'll do is, in that same state, I'll go to transform and I'll do a smooth look at. And this smooth look at I'll set the target position to that same target point. So now, when I roll my mouse around, okay, you can see that that turret is starting to follow the mouse. Okay, and I'll ignore the vertical position here if I need to, but right now this is going to work just fine. So I can roll my mouse around, and wherever my mouse is pointing, and when I click, I'm driving to that point. My mouse is also being tracked by my turret. So now I could think of this in a slightly different way, that maybe if I hold down the right click while my mouse is down, maybe that's the only time this turret starts to look around, is when I'm holding down the right click. And then maybe when I release, I could fire off a projectile. But I'll refine the gameplay here a little bit later. Right now I just want to focus on the basic input. So I got the basic mechanic of the turret looking in the direction that I want. The next thing I'll do is I'll create some objects once we fire. So I'll make an event, and I'll call this, this is my fire event. And I'll add this as a transition to another state. And this state, its job is going to be to create a game object. So I'll go to game object. I'll create a game object. And the game object that I want to create, I'm going to need to create a prefab. So what I'll do is I'll create, we'll use a sphere. And the sphere, I don't want it so big. Let me just take it down to, let's try 0.5. That still feels a little big, so I'll take it down to 0.2. That feels pretty good. And this will be our cannonball. And our cannonball, its job is going to, it's going to have an FSM on it. And its job, it's also going to have a rigid body on it. So I'll go to physics, add a rigid body. And we want to control the physics, so we'll go into physics, and we will add force. And our force will be added to the self space along the z-axis. So I'll just maybe apply 20 to the z-force. In the force mode, instead of force, let's try impulse. And let's see what the play button, and we'll watch our cannonball take off. Okay, that looked pretty good for now. I can always go back and tweak that if needed. Let me select our cannonball. I don't know if I want it to fall to the ground yet, but I'll make that decision a little bit later. Maybe I'll turn on every frame, go back to force. Again, I'll play with those values later. But now when our cannonball comes alive, we're going to have force being applied to it, and it'll fly off into the z direction. So let's save that as a prefab, and I can do that just by dragging and dropping. I have a prefab folder set up, so by dragging it into the prefab folder, I create a prefab. I'll delete the original cannonball and go back to my turret object. That's where we're building this action to fire. So in state 2, we're instantiating a game object. So I'll drag that object over. It's looking for a spawn point, and the spawn point that I'll use, I'll just go into my turret here, and I'll create another empty game object, and this will be called spawn point. And I'll throw that spawn point inside my cylinder, and that'll allow me very easily just to reset all the values. And then I will just move that there. Now, looks like it rotated because of the position that I put the cylinder in, so I'm not sure if that's going to affect the position of my sphere. We'll find out pretty quickly. But I have my spawn point just where I want it. I'll go back to my turret, and the point at which this is going to spawn is the spawn point. So let's see. We fire our object. So we're tracking with the turret. We need a little mouse put event in here. So what I need is a little bit of input here. And for now, I'll do a get mouse button down, but I suspect I'm going to change this a little bit later. So I have my get mouse down. It's a left click, and the send event will go to fire. So whenever I pick a point, I'll be executing basically the same action, but also be launching a projectile. So let's see if that works. I should be able to fire at least one. Yep. Ran into a little bit of a glitch though. It looks like my object just dropped straight to the ground. So I suspect I'm having a collider problem. I think when I spawn, I'm probably spawning into an object maybe, or maybe it's just maybe this direction of my game object is causing trouble. Let's see. We'll troubleshoot this here in a minute. Let me go back to my turret and let's see. So we're spawning an object. Let's create a finished event and we'll loop back, so I should be able to shoot multiple objects now. Okay, so it looks like what looks like it's happening is that the spawn point, because the spawn point looks like maybe it's pointing downwards, we're probably creating a little bit of a problem. So let me try to just straighten that out. Let's see if that fixes my problem. I'll just rotate it so it's pointing in the right direction. There we go. That's better. Although I'm kind of unimpressed with my... I'm pretty unimpressed with my cannon force here. So let's go back into my prefab. We'll select the state. Let's change that force back to impulse. And let's see if we get different results. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah. So now I got a little bit of a glitch. I don't like the idea that I have to fire and move both with the left click, but I do like the fact that my mouse is aiming at this point. So I'll probably change that fire event to a right click, and I can do that really quickly. I'll just go back into my turret. I'll go into state 1, and instead of using the get mouse button down, left click, I'll change that to a right click. And so now I move with the left click button, and I fire with the right click. There we go. So far, so good. So I got a few glitches here that I need to work out. My cannonballs are living too long. When they collide with something, I want them to explode or blow up, or at least disappear. But we'll start solving those problems one by one in the follow-up presentation.